Ma'am, I've asked you 3 times to identify yourself and state your business in my courtroom. And I've told you, Your Honor, respectfully, that I'm here to observe. I'm not required to say more than that. Respectfully, you sit in my court, scribbling notes, and refuse a direct order from the bench. That's contempt. It's my right, Your Honor, bailiff. Take her into custody. Let's see how she likes a night in a cell learning some respect. As you wish, Your Honor. She walked into his courtroom in a plain gray coat and sat in the back like anyone else. No title, no announcement, just a quiet woman with a notepad, watching how a small-town judge ran his kingdom. And she watched him bully a young lawyer, watched him steamroll a frightened defendant, watched him treat his courtroom like it belonged to him and no one else. She wrote it all down. He didn't like that. He didn't like her calm. He didn't like that she wouldn't tell him who she was. So he did the thing he'd done to so many before her. He called it disrespect. And he had her put in a cell overnight just to prove he could. He thought she was nobody. By morning, she was sitting at a different desk, in a different building, with his entire record spread out in front of her. Because the woman that the judge threw in jail for disrespect had the authority to end his career. What she did with it, and why she waited until morning to let him find out, is a story about the quietest kind of power there is. But first, you have to know who Camille Broussard really was. Camille Broussard was raised in stillness. She grew up in a shotgun house at the edge of Beauverde, a small town near the slow brown water of the Sabine River, raised mostly by her grandmother while her mother worked doubles at the hospital an hour away. Her grandmother's name was Willa. Miss Willa to everyone in Beauverde, a tall, straight-backed woman who had spent 40 years cleaning other people's houses and had never once, in all that time, been seen to hurry. Miss Willa moved through the world at exactly the pace she chose, and she raised her granddaughter to do the same. A lady, Miss Willa used to say, ironing shirts that belonged to families who'd never learn her last name, keeps her voice low and her spine straight. You remember that, Camille. The whole world is going to try to make you loud. Loud is easy. Loud is what they expect. You be the quiet one, because the quiet one is the one they can't read, and the one they can't read is the one they can't beat. Camille was small and watchful, and she listened. The shotgun house was hot in summer and drafty in winter, and it smelled of starch and coffee, and the lemon oil Miss Willa used on other people's furniture, and then, on Sunday, stiz on her own. Camille did her homework at the kitchen table by a single lamp while her grandmother ironed, and the sound of that iron, the hiss, the thump, the slow, steady rhythm of it, was the sound of Camille's whole childhood. Miss Willa never rushed the iron. She'd told Camille once that you could tell everything about a person by how they did the small, dull things nobody was watching. Anybody can be careful when it counts, she said. The question is whether you're careful when it doesn't. That's character, baby. Character is what you do when there's no audience. Camille listened when men on the courthouse steps talked down to her grandmother. She listened when a store clerk followed them both around the aisles as if a tall, straight-backed woman and a small girl were about to make off with the canned goods. She listened at 9 years old when a sheriff's deputy pulled her uncle over for nothing and spoke to him like he was a boy. And she watched her uncle keep his voice low and his hands visible and his spine straight. And she watched him drive away with his dignity because he refused to let anyone take it from him. Why didn't Uncle Ray say anything? She asked her grandmother that night. Miss Willa was quiet for a moment, hands still in the dishwater. Because, baby, sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to give someone the show they're trying to start. She dried her hands. That deputy wanted your uncle out loud, wanted him angry so he could call it something. Ray didn't give it to him. That's not a weakness, Camille. That is the hardest strength there is. You keep your voice low and your spine straight, and you make them do all the shouting. And then, when the time is right, she tapped the side of her head. You use this, not that. She tapped Camille's chest over her fast little heart. This. But it's not fair, young Camille said, and her voice shook. He didn't do anything. No, it's not fair. Miss Willa crouched down to her granddaughter's level, and her eyes were kind and very tired and very old. And you're going to spend your whole life meeting people who mistake their little bit of power for the whole of who they are. Deputies, bosses, men in robes. They'll test you, baby, to see if they can make you small. And here is what I need you to remember. She took Camille's face in her worn hands. They can move your body. They can put you out of a room or in a cell or on the wrong side of a door. But they cannot touch your name, and they cannot touch your dignity unless you hand it to them. So you don't hand it to them. Not ever. You keep your voice low and your spine straight, and you wait for your moment. It always comes. God is patient, and so are we. Camille carried that her whole life, voice low, spine straight. Let them do the shouting. There was faith in that house, too. A small brick church, a worn Bible on the kitchen table, hymns hummed low over the ironing. And there was a fierce, quiet insistence from both her grandmother and her God on one idea above all others, that every single person who walked the earth was owed their dignity, and that the measure of anyone's character was how they treated the people who could do nothing for them. Camille was the first in her family to go to college, then the first to go to law school on scholarships and loans and Miss Willa's savings jar, an old coffee tin that had been filling up quarter by quarter since the day Camille was born. Miss Willa lived just long enough to sit in the second row at her granddaughter's law school graduation, straight-backed as ever, and to press that emptied coffee tin into Camille's hands afterward. I always knew what this was for, she said. Now you go do what lawyers are supposed to do, and mostly don't. You go make sure the quiet ones get their dignity too. Miss Willa passed that winter. Camille kept the coffee tin on her desk for the next 30 years, wherever that desk happened to be, and Camille Brucid rose, not loudly, never loudly. She built a career the way her grandmother ironed shirts, patiently, exactly, refusing to hurry, refusing to give anyone a show. She was a public defender first, standing beside people the system had already decided about. And she was good at it precisely because she never took the bait, never let a hostile judge or a sneering prosecutor rattle her into the kind of outburst that could sink a client. She'd sit there, calm as still water, voice low, spine straight, and win with the file when the shouting was done. There was one case, early on, that she carried for the rest of her life. A boy of 19, no record, a scared kid caught in the wrong car with the wrong people, put in front of a hard judge in a hard county, with a prosecutor pushing for years he didn't deserve. The judge disliked Camille on sight, disliked her calm, her precision, the way she would not be hurried or cowed. He talked over her. He sighed at her. He tried, more than once, to bait her into the kind of outburst that would let him hold her in contempt and leave the boy defenseless. Camille didn't give it to him, not once. She kept her voice low and her spine straight, and she built the record. Objection by careful objection. Everyone noted. Everyone preserved. She lost the trial. The room was against her from the first gavel. But she'd built the file so cleanly that when it went up on appeal, a higher court read what that judge had done and threw the whole thing out, and the boy walked free. And the appeals court's written opinion named the trial judge's conduct for exactly what it was. Camille learned two things from that boy's case that she never unlearned. The first was that the record is the only witness that never gets scared, never gets tired, and never lies. The second was that the small rooms, the ones with no cameras, no reporters, no one important watching, were the rooms where justice most often quietly died, and so they were the rooms that mattered most. She learned the courtrooms of small towns like the one she came from, the ones with no cameras from the city, no reporters, no one important ever watching. She learned that those were the rooms where the worst things happened, precisely because no one was watching, because a judge in a small county could become a small king, and a small king who is never questioned forgets, over the years, that he was ever only a man in a borrowed robe. She never forgot it. She'd watched her uncle drive away with his dignity intact. She'd promised her grandmother she'd make sure the quiet ones got theirs too. She became a prosecutor and was known, strangely for that job, for her fairness, for dropping cases that shouldn't have been brought, for treating defendants like people. Then she became a judge, and on her own bench she was the opposite of everything she'd watched hurt people as a girl. Unshakably calm, scrupulously fair, and utterly immune to being flattered or provoked. Lawyers said you could not read Judge Broussard, and you could not rush her, and you could not make her angry, and that this was somehow more frightening than any judge who shouted. And she was so respected, so precise, so incorruptible, that in time the state asked her to take on one of the most important and least visible jobs in the entire judiciary. She was appointed to the state's Commission on Judicial Conduct, the small, powerful body that reviews complaints against judges, the people who judge the judges. And when a pattern of complaints piled up against a certain small county judge, complaints about bias, about bullying, about defendants, and even bystanders being jailed for contempt and disrespect on the flimsiest of excuses, the commission assigned its most careful member to look into it quietly, to go and observe, in plain clothes, in the back of the room, to see with her own eyes whether Judge Harlan Doyle of Calder County ran his courtroom the way the complaints said he did. The commission had picked the one person in the state least likely to be rattled by whatever she found. They had picked Camille Broussard. Stop and put yourself in that gray coat for a second. A judge, a man with the power to lock you in a cell, is glaring down at you, demanding you explain yourself, twisting your calm into disrespect. Every eye in the room is on you. And you know your rights, but he holds the keys. You could snap. You could argue. You could give him the fight he's fishing for. Or you could keep your voice low, your spine straight, and let him do the shouting. Which would you do? Hold that thought. Judge Harlan Doyle had run Calder County's courtroom for 19 years, and in 19 years no one had told him no. He was a big man with a big voice and a small idea of the world, and he had come to believe that the black robe and the raised bench were not the tools of his office, but the proof of his importance. His courtroom was his kingdom. His word was the only word, and the people who came before him, poor people, mostly, frightened people, people without the money, for a good lawyer, learned quickly that the fastest way through Harlan Doyle's court was to agree with everything, and never, ever make him feel small. Camille Broussard walked into the back of that courtroom on a Tuesday morning in a plain gray coat, sat on a hard wooden bench in the last row, took out a notepad, and began quietly to watch. And what she watched made her write a great deal. She watched Judge Doyle cut off a nervous young public defender, a kid named Daniel Reyes, barely a year out of law school, mid-sentence, over and over, until the young man's hands were shaking and his client's case fell apart around him. "Are you quite finished wasting my time, counselor?" Doyle said, to laughter from the bailiff. Reyes went red and sat down, defeated, and his client, a frightened man accused of a minor offense, took a plea he probably shouldn't have because his own lawyer had just been broken in front of him. Camille wrote it down, voice low, spine straight. She watched Doyle deny a woman a continuance she plainly needed, and had every right to, snapping that, "This court is not run around your schedule," though the woman had explained, twice, that she'd had no way to reach her attorney and no money for another. Camille wrote down the time, the docket number, the exact words. She watched him mock a defendant's accent, drawing it out cruelly, playing to the room. She watched him set a bail so high for a minor charge that it may as well have been a sentence on a man who plainly could not pay it, and then move on to the next case, before the man had finished trying to speak, and she watched something that turned her very still inside. She watched an old man in the gallery, there to support his grandson, mutter something under his breath. Just a sigh, really, a small sound of grief. And she watched Judge Doyle stop the entire proceeding, point at that old man, and threaten him with a night in a cell for disturbing this court. The old man went gray and shrank into his seat, terrified, and apologized, and Doyle let him sweat before waving a magnanimous hand, having made his point. "This room is mine, and your dignity is mine to grant or take, and every one of you would do well to remember it." That, Camille understood, was the whole game. Not the law, power, the pleasure of it. She wrote it all down, voice low, spine straight, and more than once she saw Doyle glance toward the back row, toward the quiet woman in the gray coat who kept writing and never looked up, and gave him nothing. It bothered him. Camille could see that it bothered him. A man like Doyle needed to be the most important thing in any room, and here was someone paying close attention to everything and giving him nothing. No fear, no flattery, no reaction. Just a pen moving steadily across a page. Finally, in a lull between cases, he couldn't stand it anymore. "You, in the back, gray coat," his voice boomed across the courtroom. "You've been writing in my court all morning. Who are you? Are you pressed?" Camille looked up, calm, unhurried. "No, Your Honor." "Then who are you? What's your business here?" "I'm here to observe, Your Honor. I'm a member of the public. This is an open courtroom." That was true. It was completely, legally true. And it was, to a man like Harlan Doyle, intolerable. An observer. He leaned forward over the bench, taking notes. "On me. In my courtroom. I'll ask you once more, and I want a real answer this time. State your name and your business, or I'll have you removed." And Camille Broussard, who had every right to decline, who was there on the lawful authority of the state itself, who knew exactly what this man was, and exactly what he was about to do, made a quiet, deliberate choice. She did not announce who she was. She thought about it in the half-second she had. One sentence would end it. "I am Justice Camille Broussard of the Commission on Judicial Conduct, and I am here reviewing this courtroom." She could watch the blood drain from his face. She could stop this before it started. But complaints are one thing, and a man showing you exactly who he is, on the record, of his own free will, in his own courtroom, is another. For 19 years, the whispers had said Harlan Doyle jailed people for nothing, for failing to grovel, for disrespect that was only ever the refusal to be afraid. And here he was, about to do it again, to a woman who had done nothing but sit quietly and take notes. If she stopped him now, she'd have a complaint. If she let him finish, she'd have the truth. Miss Willa's voice was in her ear, plain as the hiss of the iron on a winter evening. "You make them do all the shouting, and then, when the time is right, you use this, not that." So she kept her voice low and her spine straight, and she let him choose. "With respect, Your Honor," Camille said evenly, "I've committed no disruption. I've said not a word out of turn. I'm observing a public proceeding, which is my right, and I'm not obligated to state my business to do so respectfully." The courtroom went dead silent 19 years, and no one told Harlan Doyle no. His face darkened. His voice dropped low and was dangerous. "You sit in my court, you scribble your little notes about me, And now you refuse a direct order from this bench and hide behind the word respectfully, like it's a shield. He sat back. I know disrespect when I see it, and I have a remedy for it. Young Daniel Reyes, at the defense table, half rose. Your Honor, she hasn't done anything. Sit down, counselor, unless you'd like to join her. Reyes sat, stricken. Contempt of court, Judge Doyle announced, with a satisfaction that turned Camille's stomach even as her face stayed perfectly still. That's what this is, willful disrespect of this court and defiance of a lawful order. Bailiff, take her into custody. A night in a cell should teach her some manners. We'll see how much she likes writing notes in the dark. The bailiff crossed the room, uncertain, and put his hand on Camille Broussard's arm. He was a decent man. That bailiff, and everyone in the room could see he didn't want to do it. He'd worked that courtroom long enough to know the difference between a person who was disrupting a proceeding and a person who was simply refusing to be bullied. And he knew, the way everyone in that room knew, that the woman in the gray coat had done nothing but sit quietly and take notes. His hand hovered. He glanced up at the bench, one last silent question. Are you sure? Your Honor. And Harlan Doyle answered it with a flat, impatient wave of his hand. Do it. And Camille, who could have ended it with a single sentence, who could have produced her credentials right there and watched the color drain from Harlan Doyle's face in an instant, did no such thing. She closed her notepad. She capped her pen. She stood, unhurried, spine straight, and she held her hands out herself, so the bailiff wouldn't have to reach for them, sparing the decent man that much. She let him put the cuffs on her wrists without a flicker of protest. The courtroom had gone so silent you could hear the old clock on the wall. A few people had risen half out of their seats. A woman in the gallery had her hand pressed to her mouth. Every person in that room felt, in their gut, that they were watching something wrong happen. And every person in that room, conditioned by 19 years of Harlan Doyle, was too afraid to say so. Camille looked up at Harlan Doyle on his high bench, and she said only 3 words, so quiet the whole room had to lean in to hear them. As you wish, Your Honor. Then she let them lead her out. And behind her, a young public defender named Daniel Reyes sat frozen at his table. Watching a calm woman in a gray coat get jailed for the crime of not being afraid, and something in him that had been beaten down all morning stood back up, because Daniel Reyes had noticed what Harlan Doyle, in his fury, had not. The woman in the gray coat wasn't frightened. She wasn't confused. She had let this happen. She had looked, in the half-second before the cuffs went on, almost satisfied, like a person who had come a long way to see something, and had just seen it. That night, while Camille Broussard sat calmly in a holding cell, Daniel Reyes went back to his tiny office and started making calls. Daniel Reyes couldn't sleep. He kept seeing it, the cuffs, the calm, the 3 quiet words. As you wish, Your Honor. He kept turning it over. He'd spent the whole morning being humiliated by Harlan Doyle, the way he was humiliated most mornings, and he'd come to accept it as the price of the job, the weather you worked in. But the woman in the gray coat hadn't accepted it. She also hadn't fought it. She'd done something stranger and harder than either. She'd let it happen on purpose, with her eyes open, like a person laying a trap by walking into one. He kept hearing something his ethics professor had told him back in law school, a throwaway line he'd never expected to need. When a judge does something that feels wrong, look up who's allowed to do something about it. There's always someone. The trick is that most people never look. So at 10 o'clock at night, in his cramped public defender's office with the bad fluorescent light, Daniel Reyes started looking up at the woman in the gray coat. She'd been booked. So there was a name on the county record. Broussard, Camille. He typed it into every legal database his shoestring login could reach, expecting nothing, a paralegal maybe, or a law student, or a retired attorney with time to sit in on trials. And the world tilted. The first result was a photograph. The same face, the same steady eyes, looking back at him from an official state portrait. And under it, a title that made Daniel Reyes stand straight up out of his chair in an empty office at 10 at night, his heart going like a hammer. The Honorable Camille Broussard, Member, State Commission on Judicial Conduct. The people who judge the judges. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, staring at the screen, the pieces slamming into place one after another. The plain gray coat, the careful notes, the refusal to state her business, the strange, deliberate calm as the cuffs went on, the calm of someone who knew exactly what she was watching, because watching it was her job. He read on, his hands not quite steady. A distinguished career, public defender, prosecutor, judge, appointed to the commission that reviewed, investigated, disciplined, and removed judges across the entire state. The single body with the authority to end a judicial career. And then Daniel Reyes understood, all at once, what he had actually witnessed that morning. Harlan Doyle had not jailed a random woman in a gray coat. He had jailed the investigator the state had quietly sent to review him for exactly the kind of conduct he had just committed, in open court, on the record, in front of a room full of witnesses. He had been under review for jailing people on flimsy claims of disrespect. And to prove the complaints true, he had jailed the reviewer herself. For disrespect, he had handed her, gift-wrapped, the very proof she'd come to find. Daniel Reyes sat down slowly. And then, at 11 at night, he did the bravest thing of his young career. He wrote up everything he had seen that day, every ruling, every bullied lawyer, every abuse, in a clean, careful statement, and he sent it to the commission's intake office and to the county's chief administrative judge, with a note that read simply, "You need to know what happened in Judge Doyle's courtroom today." And who was in the room? He needn't have worried about proof, because Harlan Doyle's own courtroom had recorded the whole thing. Every courtroom in the state did. Audio and video, by law, running the entire session. There was a complete time-stamped recording of Judge Harlan Doyle demanding a silent, seated observer identify herself and then jailing her for disrespect when she calmly, lawfully declined. His word against hers, he might have survived his word against the tape. And the tape showed a woman who never once raised her voice, never left her seat, never said a single disrespectful thing, being put in handcuffs by a judge who didn't like being watched. By 6 the next morning, the chief administrative judge of the district had seen the recording and read Daniel Reyes's statement and made 2 phone calls. By 7, Camille Broussard's contempt citation had been reviewed and voided as plainly unlawful, and she was released from the county holding cell, where she had spent the night, by every account, perfectly calm. The overnight guard, a decent older man named Earl, who'd worked that jail for 20 years, would tell people afterward that in all his time he'd never had a prisoner like her. She hadn't argued. She hadn't demanded a phone call at midnight, or pounded on the bars, or wept. She'd asked, politely, for a cup of water and something to write with, and then she'd sat on the thin cot with her back straight against the cinder block wall and kept writing her notes, calm as a woman at her own kitchen table, until the light came up gray in the little window. When he'd asked her, near dawn, if she was all right, if there was anyone he should call, she'd looked up and given him a small, tired smile, and said only, "Someone already knows I'm here. It's just a matter of morning." He hadn't understood what she meant. By 9 o'clock, he did. The whole county did, because by 9 o'clock that morning, Camille Broussard was sitting at a desk in the district's administrative offices, showered, in her own clothes, spine straight, with the complete file on Judge Harlan Doyle spread out in front of her. His rulings, his contempt citations going back years, the complaints, and, newest of all, one fresh piece of evidence, filmed in high definition, of the judge committing the exact abuse he was being investigated for. She was, quite literally, reviewing his cases. Harlan Doyle found out the way the worst men always find out. Too late, and all at once. He arrived at his courthouse that morning, expecting a normal day of being the most important man in his small kingdom. Instead, he found the chief administrative judge waiting in his chambers, and a letter on his desk, and the news delivered quietly that the woman he'd thrown in a cell overnight for disrespect was the Honorable Camille Broussard of the Commission on Judicial Conduct, and that she had spent the morning, on the state's authority, reviewing his entire record. They say Harlan Doyle sat down very heavily in his big leather chair and did not say anything at all. For a long time, there was no shouting. There was never any shouting. That was the whole point. Camille Broussard did not storm into Harlan Doyle's courtroom to gloat or make a speech or repay his cruelty with cruelty of her own. Her grandmother had taught her better than that 30 years ago, over a sink full of dishwater. She did the thing that quiet power does, which is far heavier than any outburst. She followed the law exactly and let it fall where it had to fall. She removed herself from the final decision. She'd been the one wronged, and she would not let anyone say the process was personal. She handed her complete, meticulous review to the full commission and to the panel that would decide Doyle's fate, and she let the record speak. It spoke loudly enough. The recording of that Tuesday morning was damning on its own, but it was only the beginning. Camille's review and the flood of witnesses who came forward once they learned they finally could. People had been afraid of Harlan Doyle for 19 years, and now, at last, someone had made it safe to talk, painted a full picture of a man who had treated a public trust like a private throne. One of the first to come forward was a court clerk named Ruby Van, who had worked in Doyle's courtroom for 11 years and had watched, silently, from her desk beside the bench because a clerk who crossed Harlan Doyle did not stay a clerk for long. Ruby Van had kept something, though quietly, for years. A private list, dates, names, docket numbers, of every person she'd seen jailed for contempt or disrespect on grounds that had made her stomach turn. She'd never known what to do with it, or who could possibly be trusted with it, in a county where the judge was the law. When she heard who the woman in the gray coat had been, Ruby Van brought her list to Camille Broussard's borrowed desk and set it down and said, simply, "I've been waiting 11 years for someone I could give this to." Camille looked at the list for a long moment. Then she looked up at Ruby Van and said, "You kept your voice low and your spine straight, and you waited for your moment. It came. Thank you." The proceedings that followed were formal and public and thorough. For the first time in 19 years, Harlan Doyle sat in a room where he was not the most powerful person set. He sat at a plain table in an ordinary suit with no robe and faced a panel that reviewed the recording of that Tuesday morning in full, the whole courtroom, watching as he demanded a silent, seated woman identify herself and then jailed her for declining. They played it start to finish. They played the moment the bailiff hesitated. They played the 3 quiet words. And they played it in front of the same kind of audience Doyle had spent 2 decades performing his power. For, except now the power was gone, and all that was left was the plain record of what a man does when he believes no one who matters is watching. Witness after witness followed. The young public defender, the court clerk with her 11-year list. The woman denied her continuance. The family of the boy whose case had collapsed. One by one, quiet people who had spent years being afraid of Harlan Doyle stood up in a room where, at last, it was safe and simply told the truth about what they had seen. Doyle's own lawyers had little to work with. You cannot argue with a videotape, and you cannot cross-examine a public record. His defense, in the end, amounted to the oldest defense of the small tyrant, that he had only been keeping order, that respect for the court required it, that he had done nothing every judge doesn't do. Camille Broussard, who was not on the deciding panel, she had recused herself the moment she was released, so that no one could ever call the outcome personal, sat quietly in the gallery for that part, in the back row, in a plain coat, taking notes, and if Harlan Doyle glanced back at her once and understood, at last, exactly what it felt like to be the one being watched by someone whose judgment you could not escape, well, that was between him and his conscience, and the record does not say. Judge Harlan Doyle was suspended, and then, after the full review, removed from the bench. 19 years of running his kingdom ended by the one person he assumed was nobody. He was stripped of the robe he had confused for his own worth. He kept his freedom, but not his gavel, and never sat in judgment of another human being again. They say that on his last day he sat a long time in his empty courtroom, in the big leather chair, in the silence, and that, for the first time in 19 years, there was no one left in that room to be afraid of him, and that the silence, at last, told him exactly what he had been. And here is the part that mattered most to Camille, the part her grandmother would have cared about, and her God. She did not stop at the man. She went after the harm. Every person Harlan Doyle had jailed on a hollow contempt or disrespect charge. Every frightened defendant railroaded into a bad plea. Every case he'd decided from spite. Every name on Ruby Van's quiet 11-year list was pulled back up and reviewed. Convictions that couldn't stand were vacated. People who had been wronged, quietly, in a small courtroom no one important ever watched, finally got their dignity back. The frightened man whose case fell apart the morning Camille sat in the back row got a new hearing and a real defense and walked out free. The old man in the gallery who'd been threatened with a cell for the crime of sighing received a written apology on state letterhead. A small thing, maybe, but he framed it and hung it in his front room, because in 70 years no one in a robe had ever once told him he'd been wronged. The woman denied her continuance had her case reopened. One by one, the quiet people Harlan Doyle had death-stepped on were lifted back up and told, in the language of the law itself, that what had been done to them was not right and would not stand, because that was the whole point, not one man's downfall. 100 quiet people's dignity restored. Daniel Reyes, the young public defender who couldn't sleep, who looked up a name at 10 at night, who was brave enough to write it all down, did not go unnoticed. Camille Broussard made sure of it. She recommended him for a fellowship, mentored him herself, and years later, when Daniel Reyes was sworn in as a judge in his own right, it was Camille who administered the oath. He asked her that day why she'd let Doyle jail her when a single word would have stopped it. Camille thought about her grandmother's coffee tin, which sat on her desk still, 30 years on. "Because a complaint is a piece of paper," she said. "But a man showing the whole world exactly who he is, on the record, of his own free will, that's the truth. He was always going to do it to someone that day, Daniel. The only question was whether it would be someone he could break, or someone who could make it count. I just made sure it was the second kind. Better me, who spent one calm night in a cell knowing exactly how it ended, than another frightened soul who couldn't fight back and would carry it for the rest of their life." She smiled. "My grandmother spent 40 years cleaning houses for people who never learned her name, and she was the most powerful person I have ever known, because there was not one thing on this earth that could make her hand over her dignity. She taught me the whole secret when I was younger than you. You keep your voice low and your spine straight, and you let them do all the shouting. And then, when the time is right, you don't shout back. Camille's eyes were steady and bright. You just open the file. Daniel Reyes carried those words onto his own bench and ran his own courtroom by them. For the rest of his life, Camille Broussard went on serving on the commission for many years, feared by the handful of judges who deserved to be, and quietly loved by every honest one, and by every quiet soul who ever came before a fair bench because of the standard she held. Word of what she'd done. The justice who let herself be jailed to catch a tyrant spread through the small counties where the cameras never went, and something shifted in those rooms. Small kings grew careful, because you never knew, anymore, whether the quiet woman in the back row in the plain coat was nobody at all, or the one person in the state who could end you. She kept the coffee tin on her desk to the end, and, on the wall behind her, where anyone she disciplined would have to look at it, she hung a small framed card with words in her grandmother's plain, straight hand, words Miss Willa had said over a sink full of dishes a lifetime ago. Keep your voice low and your spine straight, then use this, not that. Every judge she ever disciplined had to sit beneath those words and read them. Most of them, she suspected, never understood what they meant. The ones who did were the ones who never ended up in her office in the first place. Here's what I want you to carry out of this room with you. How many Harlan Doyles are out there right now? Small men in big chairs, mistaking the power they were loaned for a worth they never earned, certain that the quiet person in front of them is nobody. And here's the deeper question. When someone tries to bait you into being loud, to give them the show they want so they can call it something, do you have the strength to keep your voice low and your spine straight and let them do all the shouting? If this story moved you, do 3 things for me. Drop a comment and tell me about the strongest quiet person you've ever known. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that dignity is a kind of power no one can arrest. And subscribe and tap that bell so the next story finds you, because the loudest man in the room is almost never the strongest. Sometimes the strongest one is the woman in the gray coat one, the one they just put in handcuffs, who already knows how this ends.